Welcome to our second week in our series for the month of May entitled, May I Have Your Order Please? It's a fast food themed series. We would have more thematic elements if we were in the building, but since we're not in the building, we don't. But the concept is trying to discover or find where there's order in the midst of a very chaotic season. And is God present, and can we account for him in the midst of all of this? We wanted to spend some time in the book of Job, and I shared with you last week, while I've read Job a lot, or while I have referenced it at times, this is the first time that I've ever attempted to work out a sermon series from the book. And I'll tell you, it's not easy to do. You have 42 chapters of material, most of which is poetry, and most of which is debate between Job's friends, who have one particular view of God and of the circumstances, and Job, who has a very different experience of his circumstances and God in the midst of his world. And so it doesn't lend itself to easy preaching. It doesn't lend itself to systematic thinking. And it doesn't lend itself to easy answers, which I think is why it's appropriate for climates such as these, pandemics, personal suffering, questioning where God is in the midst of one's own trials. It makes it very, very appropriate. But I'll caution you as we enter into today, if you go into the book of Job looking for very easy answers to those kinds of questions, you're probably not going to find them. Job is the wisdom example of how do we answer unanswerable questions? How do we account for the mystery of God whenever the mystery is going to still be mysterious? Whenever God is beyond our capacity to comprehend, and yet we're trying to understand as much as we can. These elements are the domain of the book of Job. And so surely, perhaps, you know the beginning and you know the end. And at the end of the book of Job, God doesn't answer Job's questions. He doesn't tell him why. He doesn't give him explanations. What he does is he answers Job's questions with himself and his own character and his own power and his own majesty. And for Job, the presence of God is sufficient. It's more than sufficient, even though it may not answer all of his questions. The book is set up with these cycles of debate. And Job has three friends that come and sit with him in the midst of his misery. Their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And all three of them are supposedly figures of wisdom. They're very religious. They're very well spoken. And they each take their turn on the stage trying to give explanation, comfort, and solutions to Job during the midst of his trials. Beginning in chapter 4, what you have is three literary cycles of speeches. A friend will speak, Job will answer. Another friend will speak, and Job will answer. The third friend will speak, and Job will answer. And it doesn't work quite that neatly in every cycle. The first cycle runs from chapter 4 through chapter 14. It's 10 chapters, 11 chapters. So if you'd like to read through all of those this week, that certainly would be appropriate and would be in alignment with our time of worship this month. But what I'm going to try and do is summarize these chapters with a couple of themes that give you some perspective into this dynamic between Job's friends and Job's experience, because they don't line up. I wonder if you have noticed the disjoint in different people's experiences throughout our current COVID-19 shutdown. People have all kinds of experiences, and if you or someone you know has lost their job as a result of the shutdown, you may feel very, very strongly about the economic impacts of this situation. If you know someone who has had a family member that suffered from coronavirus, maybe you've known someone that's died as a result, you may have very, very different feelings about the physical toll, the illness itself, depending on the voices that you listen to, depending on your own personal experiences. we all kind of approach suffering in unique ways, and we all come at it from different perspectives and different places. It's the reality of human suffering. There are similarities, to be sure, but similarities are not always one-for-one equals. Job is going through great loss. He's lost his family, he's lost his livelihood, and he is now in the process of losing his health. And as you see vented through his speeches and complaints, perhaps one of the last straws for Job as he begins to question God. In the midst of all of this, is it possible that he's going to lose his faith? At the very beginning, he tells his wife, should we accept good from God and not bad? It's a very faithful, bold statement. But we see Job throughout the book wavering. And he will have statements of faith and he will have statements of doubt, and he will say something about God's majesty and power, and then he'll question God's justice, question God's character. Job's experience is very unique, and Job's friends come around him not having shared his experience, having their own opinions and their own perspectives, and have lots of things to say, lots of words, lots of insights, lots of points, lots of debates, lots of theology. But the experience of suffering and the answer of simple proverbial wisdom, systematic theology, they don't go well together in the book of Job. They don't go well. And I want you to see a picture of Job's friends. Not only, here's where this applies for us today, because we need to be able to process, first of all, our own experience. In trials like these, for some, this may be very, very trying time. For others, it's not been as difficult. But all of us experience suffering at some point in our lives. All of us face trials. And so, from the perspective of Job, there's lessons to be learned, how we process this in our relationship with God. There's also very, very many important lessons to be learned about Job's friends and how we provide support and comfort to those who are suffering. Because in these days, we are both individuals trying to connect with God through a trying season, but we're also the church trying to extend comfort and peace and hope to other people around us who may be very, very unsure of their future, of our future, and what's happening. And so there are applications to be made both from Job's point of view and the friend's point of view. What I'd like to do in this message is give you the points first, because they're lengthy texts we're going to look at, and I want you to be able to look for these qualities as we read. And so, the first point in our message this morning is about the friends of Job. The friends, as you'll see, when they begin responding to Job, they stand on their traditions, on their traditional religious theology about God, and they simply espouse those same common ideas. You'll see in the point what we have written here. They claim tradition as an authority. This is what we've always believed. This is what our fathers saw and believed. They use common proverbial sayings. In fact, you'll see Job even respond to that later on in the message. Common proverbial sayings. In our context, that can be, God's always there to work out good. Everything's going to be just fine. Things that, and you'll notice in the case of Job's friends, sometimes they say things that resonate as truth with us, but they're not 100% true, or else Job wouldn't be in this scenario. They offer common proverbial sayings. They offer the age of the elders as authority. One even uses this mysterious vision you'll see in this first reading, that God spoke to me, or I've seen it, or I've heard a message from him. All of these things they use to support views of God that at the end of the book are shown to be wrong. Job 42:7, God speaks of the three friends. He says, "You have not spoken the truth about me." And so it's a warning to us that we can stand on tradition, our orthodox views of God, messages that we discern personally, and we can still be wrong if we assume to speak for God perfectly, completely, always. The friends do this. That's a challenging reality to face. The view of God that they espouse is a simplified, systematic one. God is great and mysterious, but he always works the same. He punishes the wicked, he blesses and restores the upright. And so if Job is suffering, Job must have done something wrong. And as we see, Job pushes back against this simplified perspective of God and the world. Once again, the friends stand on their traditional religious theology of God. And it proves to be incorrect. Let's begin reading in chapter 4, verse 7. This is Eliphaz, who really comes across as maybe the leader of the three. He's the most outspoken of the three. And his entire speech, chapter 4 and 5, is worth reading. I just have chosen a section of it to give you some context here. He says, "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed," he uses his own experience and assumes that his own experience is universal. We do that a lot when we encounter people that are suffering. We assume our own experience is universal to theirs. "As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it." It sounds like Eliphaz has been reading Proverbs. There is a sense of order, and a lot of times those who plow evil do reap it. "At the breath of God they are destroyed. At the blast of his anger they perish. The lions may roar and growl, yet the teeth of the great lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered." Already we see Eliphaz claiming his own experience, claiming the traditions of their religion. And then notice, he says, "A word was secretly brought to me. My ears caught a whisper of it. Amid disquieting dreams in the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stopped, but I could not tell what it was. A form stood before my eyes, and I heard a hushed voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker?" Of course, the answer to Eliphaz's questions are obviously no. He's stating, can a mortal be more righteous than God? The answer is no. Can a man be more pure than his maker? In this case, when talking about God, the answer is no. It's not so much what Eliphaz is saying, but that he takes these proverbs, these sayings, these intuitions, and brings them into Job's suffering and offers these traditional systematic answers. This is a much more poetic way of saying, Job, we don't see the innocent suffering like you do. What we see is when people plow wickedness, they suffer like you do. So you connect the dots. There's a backhanded accusation here with Job's friends, but Eliphaz is standing on a very traditional view of God, that people who do right are a proverbial view of sorts. And it's not, we can blame him in the context of Job, but the reality is whenever we in our world see bad things happen, when coronavirus happens, when 9/11 happens, when Hurricane Harvey happens, we've always seen religious figures be quick to say, Hurricane Katrina, that's God's judgment on these people. Bad happens because bad was done. That this is God's judgment here. We boil down suffering and calamity to simple mathematical formulas, that God is like a robot, and that bad happens because of bad and good happens because of good. Blessings come on the righteous and judgment comes on the wicked, as though our personal experience is so simplified. In the voice of the second friend, Bildad, in chapter 8, verses 8 through 10, you see some of the same sentiment voiced. He says, "Ask the former generations and find out what their fathers learned. For we were born only yesterday, and we know nothing. Our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not instruct you and tell you? Will they not bring forth words from their understanding?" Bildad was so sensitive and kind. In his early speech, he even said, if your sons committed sin, then clearly their death was a result of their sin. Job, grieving the loss of his children, his friend is so kind to tell him they must have died because they'd done something wrong. There's a tension in this theology. I hope you feel the tension in this theology, because on the one hand, whenever Bildad says your sons must have died because of their sins, we recognize that that is not okay. We would never do that. And yet, there's a part of us that identifies our world doesn't work this way, where the righteous always succeed and the wicked always lose. It doesn't work that way. And yet, we also have experienced those times whenever something bad happens to somebody, and in our mind we wonder, I wonder what they did. I wonder what they did to bring that about. I wonder what they did to deserve that. When good happens, and maybe we think the same, really, I wonder what they did. Or we say, they don't really deserve that. Why should that good thing happen in their life? I know them, and they don't deserve that. We on the one hand, we get it, and on the other hand, we just have this sense of equity and justice that good should always be blessed and evil should always be punished. And in the economy of God, the answer is yes, that is the way eternity will be. We trust that that is a perfect picture of justice. But God has entered into this relationship in this world with us, fallen creatures, and like we said last week, God brings order into chaos, but sin pushes chaos back into order. God orders the garden, Adam and Eve sin and allow chaos back in, death and the curse back in. And so Job's friends, they stand on simple systematic views of God, and we'll find they don't bring any comfort or help to Job at all. And in the end, God even will say, you have not spoken correctly of me. A second point in considering the friends is less has to do with their theology and their authorities, and more has to do with just their pastoral care. It's not only their thinking about God, but how they interact with Job. The second point of this message, the friends seem to have all the answers. And in doing so, they insult Job's suffering. The friends do not appear to have known suffering. They offer rote theology. They cast blame. They suggest what is to them obvious solutions. But all of these things are empty because they do not understand Job. They do not understand Job's suffering. And again, as we see, they do not correctly understand God. They don't correctly understand God. Let's look at the third friend's speech, Zophar, in chapter 11. Although we could point out again Eliphaz basically saying, as I have observed those who plow evil and sow trouble reap it. I mean, he's suggesting the very same. Zophar just gets to be a little bit more pointed with it. Chapter 11, verse 10, he says, if he comes along and confines you in prison and convenes a court, who can oppose him? Speaking about God. Surely he recognizes deceitful men, and when he sees evil, does he not take note? But a witless man or a fool can no more become wise than a wild donkey's foal can become a man. Yet, if you devote your heart to him and stretch out your hands to him, if you put away the sin that is in your hand and allow no evil to dwell in your tent, then you will lift up your face without shame. You will stand firm and without fear. Very formulaic. It's very poetic. Metaphors, prisons, and things like that, but it's still very formulaic. Surely God recognizes deceitful men. Surely when he sees evil, he takes note of it. It's kind of a backhanded way of pointing at Job and his current trials. If you would just acknowledge it and repent, then God would restore you, because the same simple formula that's brought suffering on you would also bring restoration on you. Again, back to the very beginning, to the Satan's accusation that Job only worships God because the good things in Job's life. His friends are serving to tempt that very notion that you should accept a theology of God that will be easy for you, that will bless you, that will bring restoration to you. Notice Job's response in chapter 12 to Zophar's speech. He says, I have become a laughingstock to my friends, though I called upon God and he answered. A mere laughingstock, though righteous and blameless. Men at ease have contempt for misfortune as the fate of those whose feet are slipping. It's a great line. Men at ease have contempt for misfortune as though it's the fate of those whose feet are slipping. I put it in the thoughts for response, and we'll see that momentarily, but it asks you to consider your own suffering and how suffering gives you insight into life experiences. The loss of a loved one is a very easy one to consider. But even the loss of a loved one, the loss of a parent, is very, very different than the loss of a child. The loss of a friend, very different than the loss of a spouse. But how those experiences give you insight into other people who have had them and other people who will. And it also educates you in how little you really know about someone else's suffering if you've not walked in their shoes. We get the impression that Job is experiencing something here that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar never have. They never have. And so they're not really sure what to say. And what they do say, when they do decide to speak, is of no help. The nature of suffering. The friends have all the answers, but they really don't. And they seem to insult and undermine Job's suffering in the midst of all of this. And Job oftentimes points it out. What would the friends have been better doing? You know, we pick on them. The poet and the writer of Job has really put them in a very painted them in a negative light. We are told at the beginning they come and sit with Job for a long period of time. They try to be sensitive. Eliphaz, you know, he opens up his speech in chapter 4 by telling Job, he says, look how many you have instructed, how many feeble hands you have strengthened. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. He starts by pointing out how good Job has been, how righteous and strong he's been, how much he's helped others. The friends try, but they assume that they understand the situation perfectly, and that's a false assumption. It's an arrogant assumption. And they assume that God's role in Job's plight is easy to discern, and that's also a false assumption. Listen, where is God and what is his role in a global pandemic? Where is God and what is his role in a hurricane? In an economic collapse that Christians are feeling even before this in places like Venezuela? Where is God what is his role in genocide and warfare? And writers and preachers and theologians have tried to cobble together neat little systematic theologies that answer all the questions and point out exactly where God is and exactly what God's role is and exactly how we should think about it. But the book of Job is almost a witness against trying to do that, because the friends try to do that, and they're the enemies. I mean, enemy is a strong word, but they're the antagonists in the story here. Job is the one who looks at the situation and says, I don't see where God is in this. This runs in contradiction to what I know about God, what I believe about him. And this tension of faith enters into Job's life. And we, in our very common, very easy religious experience, a lot of times are led to believe that if there's a tension of faith in us, that is sin. That's something we need to avoid. We need to push it down. We need to not ask those questions. We need to take simple, easy, proverbial answers, snippet Bible verses that give us comfort. We need to offer those. Job, in one of his verses, will say, it's like food that has no taste. When I come to this place, I can't even eat. What you have to offer me is of no value. Job comes to this crisis of faith, and all of his his friends, instead of listening, instead of asking questions, instead of seeking to empathize, instead of allowing Job's experience to try and become sort of their own, to understand it from his point of view, they simply approach Job's point of view from their outside perspective, their tradition, their theology, their common understanding of God, their all of these authorities that we see leaked into their messages. As a church who seeks to do ministry to people that are suffering, you can do nothing better than sit and listen and ask questions and understand, seek understanding. They're the best things that you can do. Because, as we'll find throughout the book of Job, what brings Job comfort was not the answers of his friends. It was not their theologies. It was not their parables. It was not their advice. What brings Job comfort was the presence of God. The presence of God. And we have to learn how to be the presence of God in our own way, in part, how we act as the presence of God in the midst of suffering. And several sermons we've talked about Clear Lake Food Pantry delivering food. That's a way that we practice the presence of God in the lives of other people. And we don't have to give answers. We don't have to give theology in these moments. When people are suffering, have lost jobs, or going hungry, we practice the presence of God in the lives of other people. We sit. We cry. We listen. We don't try to make light of. We don't try to approach big, ginormous, painful questions and suffering and trauma with simple answers, with simple, common theology. We approach it with the mystery of God, that God is big, that we believe God is there even in the midst of this, and we understand a great deal about him, but there's even more that we don't understand about him. And Job's friends never really seem to get this, and what they do is they come into a bad situation for Job and they make it worse. Their good intentions pile on, and they compound Job's suffering. So what does Job do? In response to all three of these friends, Job issues a response. And if you read carefully, you find sometimes he's responding to his friends, sometimes he's responding to God. You have to pay attention as you read, because he goes back and forth. But the third point in this message looks at Job. Job's experience does not fit his friend's simple view of God. And so, he takes his complaint to God himself. Job's experience does not fit the simple view, and so he takes his complaint directly to God. Crises do challenge our simple, easy answers. They break our systematic formulas, and in those moments, some insist on just perpetuating their simple, easy theologies and answers. Job's friends do. Sometimes in our own suffering, we do the same. We hunker down and we wrap those around us. Some people will ignore God or choose to disregard God. The answers don't provide comfort. They don't give any kind of help, and so they just walk away. But Job has a complaint. Job believes God is there. He understands God's majesty. He fears coming into God's presence, but he has a complaint. He is angry. He doesn't understand, and God is the only one to whom he can turn. God is the only one in whom he can find salvation. And so, you'll see in his speeches here, he really expects perhaps that him bringing his complaint before God, that God will strike him down. He pauses, he lingers, he waits, he thinks God is going to kill me for saying these things. But ultimately, the pain and suffering in his life pushes him to a point where he can't help but take his complaint to God, because there's no one else to whom he can turn. And so he does. Chapter 6, Job's first response to Eliphaz, verses 1 through 17. Job replied, "If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous." It's a great metaphor, a great image. If my anguish could be weighed and my misery placed on the scales, they would weigh more than all the sands of the seas. Verse 4, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. Does a wild donkey bray when it has grass, or an ox bellow when it has fodder? But is tasteless food eaten without salt, or is there flavor in the white of an egg? But I refuse to touch it. Such food makes me ill. His grief is so great that he can't even eat. Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut me off. Then I would still have this consolation, my joy in unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One. He says, I'm not denying God or God's character or his nature. I wish that God would kill me before I come to a place where I do. That's what Job is saying here. What strength do I have that I should still hope? What prospects that I should be patient? Do I have the strength of stone? I'm not a rock. Is my flesh bronze? Do I have any power to help myself now that success has been driven from me? A despairing man should have the devotion of his friends, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers, speaking of his friends, are as undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow when darkened by thawing ice and swollen with melting snow, but that cease to flow in the dry season and in the heat vanish from their channels. He says, that's how dependent my friends are. Just like a stream that swells and disappears. He talks about God, he talks about his friends. Job is expressing his anguish. Expressing his anguish here. Turn to chapter 9. His response to the second speech, to Bildad's speech. Just a few verses here. Verse 32. You'll hear him express his desire, and there's a lot of legal language in Job. Job wants to put God on trial. He wants God to account for or give answer for what has befallen Job. But he's kind of scared to do that. Verse 32, he says, God is not a man like me, that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. If only there were someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand upon us both, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. He wants to take his complaint to God. He wants to voice his anger, his frustration. He knows who God is. God is God. God is not a man like me. There is no arbitrator that could stand between me and God and hold God accountable because he's God. There is no way. There's no one to say to God, God, back off from Job so that he's not scared, so that he can speak freely, because God is God. Job acknowledges who God is, and he is terrified to bring his complaints before him. He finishes his speech in chapter 10, the third friend Zophar in chapter 11. And then Job begins the speech that rounds out this first cycle. It runs chapters 12, 13, and 14. And in chapter 13, you hear him. In a couple of places here, he kind of gets his courage up. Chapter 13, verse 3, but I desire to speak to the Almighty and to argue my case with God. You, speaking to his friends, however, you smear me with lies. You are worthless physicians, all of you. If only you would be altogether silent. For you, that would be wisdom. Job speaking to the pain and the insults of his friends. They weren't intended to be insults, but that's what they were to Job. He says, silence would have been wisdom for you instead of all of these espoused, words that you've offered. And then down to verse 12. To his friends again, he says, your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. So you keep silent and let me speak. And then let come to me what may. In other words, I'm going to stand in front of God and I'm going to offer my complaint. And if he strikes me down, then let it happen. Why do I put myself in jeopardy and take my life in my hands? Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And all of his poetry and all of these words, and all of Job's anguish and torment and complaint, this element of faith is still present in the midst there. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. Indeed, this may turn out for my deliverance. He says, there is nobody I can turn to for deliverance except God. And so God may save me, God may kill me. I will put myself in the hands of God. Indeed, this may turn out for my deliverance, for no godless man would dare come before him. Listen carefully to my words. Let your ears take in what I say. Now that I have prepared my case, I know I will be vindicated. Can anyone bring charges against me? If so, I will be silent and die. It's tough. Job is a hard book. It's a hard book, and it doesn't, as I said earlier, it doesn't offer easy answers. But sometimes in the midst of suffering in our own lives, it is exactly the kind of medicine that we need. It's the kind of medicine, I think it's written in that way, because in seasons of suffering, that's what our experiences are. Are there easy answers to what's going on in our world today? No, there aren't. Are there easy answers to what God's role is in all of this? The answer is no. Did God cause it? Did God permit it? How long is God going to let it go on? Is this a product of just human carelessness? We don't know. We don't know. What we know and we trust and believe is God's presence. We believe God is with us. We believe that God is sovereign, that he has power over all of these things. He could choose to cause things to go differently, but to understand the mind of God, there's just not easy answers in this crisis or in any other. And so Job, I value it so much because it tells me that whenever I get in that place of confusion, when I get in that place of being unsure, when I don't know what the next step is, when I'm not really sure how to talk to him, when I'm not really sure what my faith looks like, when we enter into those dark places, the Bible acknowledges that that is a part of the human condition, and it acknowledges that can be part of our connection with God, and it gives us an example of someone who does so. At the end of the day, at the end of the book, what you find here is three friends who say all the right things about God, but what they long for and they cherish is this systematic, organized, formulaic version of God. What Job longs for is a God that he can come into contact with and can explain even the unexplainable, a God that he relates to, that he knows, that knows him. They're two very, very different experiences. And Job is thought less of by his friends, thought more of by the history of Christianity. But I do wonder if at times, if we don't exemplify the friends more often than we do Job. Not easy answers. Not easy answers. A couple of thoughts for you by way of response and application. On the one hand, I've already alluded to this. What types of suffering have you experienced? And how did the experience or experiences change the way you view others who have shared it in the past or others who are sharing it in the present? Suffering gives us a window. It gives us insight. Even if we've shared suffering, we should always be careful to assume that our experience is exactly the same as somebody else's. And if we haven't shared in those sufferings, we should be very, very cautious at pretending to understand and believe. We can only understand up to a point, and we can listen and learn. But how does suffering shape us, and how does suffering become a tool of ministry in our lives as Christians? It's a very poignant question. And it's an answer for me, not that God causes those things or brings those things into our life, but it's a way that God can redeem those experiences. He can bring value back out of them by giving us insight into how to help others. All of a sudden, we minister not as friends standing aside, throwing proverbs, but we're able to minister to people side by side with them, holding their hand, walking through challenging experiences with them, because we know that those answers may not help, that those simple proverbs may not comfort at all. We understand. And a second thought for response today: did you find God in crisis? Have you found him in crisis? Even in the current crisis, have you found him? And if so, what brought you comfort? What was it that brought you comfort? What mysteries remain unanswered? There's a tension in us seeing the presence of God and feeling it, and also having questions unanswered, where, like at the end of Job, God says, I'm not going to tell you why this happened. I'm not going to tell you how this came about, Job, but I will answer you with me. I will answer you with me. I'll remind you of my presence. I'll remind you of my wisdom. And if you truly understand and know me, then that will be enough. Where do you see God's presence? And what questions remain unanswered? And do you realize that unanswered questions, when left to the mystery of God, are okay? They're okay. God's presence is with us. We won't understand everything until we go and meet him face to face. I hope this message brings you comfort today, whatever level of anxiety or trauma or suffering this season may have brought into your life. And if it's not coronavirus, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's another issue in your life, maybe something past that you're still wrestling with. And even if it's none of those, maybe it'll give you some foundation for weathering life storms, continuing to be women and men of faith who could say, whatever God brings my way, even though he slay me, I will put my trust in him.